Hi, welcome back to Study Hall. My name is Jill Zamorsky. I'm a Master Sommelier, and on this series, I like to share tips and hints about things that I did when I was pursuing and studying in pursuit of different wine certifications. And we're back in my living room, and it's been a minute since I've talked about blind tasting, but you know what? It's kind of the season of exams again, as we're kind of getting a hold of situations with COVID and quarantines. Actual in-person exams are starting again, whether that's with the WSET, the Wine and Spirits Education Trust, or with the Court of Master Sommeliers. Students at all different levels can now take tests in person, depending on where you are in the world and in the country. And so I wanted to tackle one of the most daunting subjects for me personally in my pursuit of certifications, and I think for a lot of people, and that's blind tasting. And again, you'll notice no wine. I could taste wine on camera, but there's actually techniques that I developed and that I utilized and that people helped me with that I think don't necessarily even involve the traditional method of blind tasting. So let's talk about blind tasting. When we say that term to a consumer, to somebody who's not in the wine trade, oftentimes they think about the fact that maybe you're blindfolded. Maybe you actually can't see the wine. And we know that's not the case. For professional purposes, blind tasting means that you are poured wine without knowing the grape or the producer or the provenance, but all you can see is that the wine is red or white, or maybe even sparkling or rosé, depending on what organization you're pursuing certification through. And that's a really key thing. Now, if we think about the grid as it applies to the Court of Master Sommeliers specifically, we divide the grid, which is the sort of the structure of our tasting note, into several different categories. We start with the sight, what the wine looks like. And so this is a little bit of a no-brainer. You can tell immediately, because for all tasting exams everywhere in the world, for certification purposes, the glasses that are used are clear glass. They're translucent. You can see the color of the wine. So that portion of the grid is actually kind of small. It's pretty short. I was once counseled that I probably shouldn't spend more than about 20 seconds describing the sight portion of a wine. And for Court of Master Sommelier standards, you have 4 minutes and 10 seconds per wine. And so that's not a lot of time. You very quickly need to assess, is the wine red or white? What color is it within those categories? Because we know there's different hues, different tones of wines, whether they're red or they're white. And then we can make other observations. If there is rim variation from the core of the wine in the glass out towards the edge where it thins out, or if there's sediment, if there's any trapped gas, there's some assessments we can make very quickly. But they all hinge on knowing what color the wine is, because in the world of wine, there are only so many grapes that are considered fair game to be testable. There are thousands of species, there's thousands of different grape varieties out there. Species Vitis vinifera. And that's what we're talking about when we're blind tasting. We're tasting wines from this species, but not every wine on the planet is fair game. It is somewhat narrowed down based on wines that are, available around the world. So me here in Chicago and you in London or you in South Africa, you should be able to taste an example of a wine made from that grape in, a given style. And some places in the world have legally governed styles of wine production, and sometimes it's a little bit more of a free-for-all. But the minute you see the color of the wine, you can narrow out half of the wines in the world. If you see that the wine is white, you know exactly what it's not. You know it's not a Cabernet Sauvignon or a Syrah or a Pinot Noir. Now, I know that there are white wines made from Pinot Noir, but we're talking about fair game academic testing here. No curveballs, no trick wines. There's no Merlot Blanc that's going to be poured for you in a wine exam. And so just based on the color, if you were using a clear glass, you can immediately narrow and eliminate half the wines in the world, which is great. And if you have watched this series before, I did an episode on kind of the theory of wine tasting, not having wine in your glass, including things like flashcards I made for myself or comparing and contrasting similar wine styles. But a few years ago, a fellow Master Sommelier, before I had passed the exam, had done a tasting exercise for me, and it was probably one of the most challenging tasting exercises I'd ever taken part of. And I was a fairly experienced taster. I was preparing for the MS exam. I'd passed the advanced exam, so I knew how to blind taste. I knew the structure. I had my grid memorized, by heart. And I was expecting, 3, 4, 6 glasses of wine, maybe even more, poured in a pretty traditional clear white wine glass, good old all-purpose glass. But lo and behold, the wine was poured in a black glass. And you may or may not have ever seen something like this just out there. Now, the whole idea behind blind tasting wine in a glass like this is that it's opaque glass. And if you put a white wine in here or a red wine, no matter what the color is, you can't tell because the glass is so dark. And so it becomes truly a blind tasting exercise because you are taking away the first thing you observe when you look at the glass of wine. You can't say any of those things that we would talk about in the sight portion of the grid. So then it's almost as if you truly did have a blindfold. You're just less likely to spill on yourself. You are solely relying upon your ability to determine the aromas and accurately assess them, and to then taste the wine and kind of suss it out based on its flavors and its structure. This is a lot harder than it sounds. Or you know what, maybe it does sound really hard. And if it does, you're correct, because it's really freaking hard. And so this is a good exercise, not as a primary method of honing your blind tasting skills, but an auxiliary method of honing your skills, where if you know the grid and you're familiar with classic grape varieties and styles of wines, if you have done blind tasting at a level before where you know the different components you're looking for and you know how to accurately describe a wine, well, make it harder on yourself. I've talked in previous episodes, you could maybe do speed trials or you could do semi-lateral blinds. There's a lot of different things you can do to enhance and develop your skills that aren't necessarily by the book how we might blind taste wines. Now, this is really tricky. So if you choose to do this for yourself, first of all, you can find glasses like this anywhere. You can find them online. This is just a regular old glass. For what it's worth, Riedel does make them. They're pretty expensive, but you can find, off-brand or non-brand glasses out there. And I love a thrifty tip for studying methods, because let's face it, let's spend our money on the wine, right? And so what I would recommend when and if you try something like this is start with some really characterful wines. But before you even start with that, one thing that's really important is, irrespective of red wines or white wines, they need to be at the same temperature. We know that most white wines are served at a cooler temperature than red. And if you were to pull a bottle of white wine out of your fridge and pour that into one glass and pour some red wine into another that was more of a cool room temperature, just that sensation alone would defeat the purpose of this exercise. So similar or same temperature. You don't obviously have to go through the sight portion of your grid, but you then want to smell the wine and you want to think about, does it smell like fruit or flowers or, earthy components? Is there evidence of oak aging on this wine? And it's a lot harder than you think. So keep the temperature constant and maybe start with something that's really expressive. For example, one of the I think most expressive grape varieties out there is Sauvignon Blanc. And Sauvignon Blanc actually is related to and has similar characteristics to some very well-known red grapes, such as Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. They're all related. And so this would be a really good example of a grape that wouldn't be a gimme. It wouldn't be easy. It's a dry wine, and it's got, herbaceous characteristics, and sometimes there can be oak on the wine, but it's got some very obvious, aromatic and flavor notes to the wine. And so it's not subtle, it's not shy. It will kind of announce itself, even if you can't see what color it is. So my recommendation would be to start with something kind of assertive and then just see how you go. And another tip that I mentioned in the past is using the voice memo feature on your phone or on your computer and record yourself. Because again, if you don't know what it is, if somebody pours, obviously someone's gonna need to pour the wine for you so you don't see what it is. You could still pour and mix up a couple of different glasses, but listen to yourself after the fact and see what you got correct or incorrect and how you might have mistook that for something if you didn't get the right answer. If you are, by yourself and you don't have somebody who can pour wines for you, all is not lost. If you think back to a few episodes ago, I talked about semi-blind laterals, or semi-blind tasting and semi-blind laterals, and I would pour, 3 different white wines in clear glasses, and I would put a little Post-it note on the bottom of each glass, and I'd mix them up, and then I'd walk away, and then I'd come back and I'd mix them up again, and then I would see how quickly I could determine the identity of the wine without really remembering what it was. You can use a similar technique here. Most glasses come in sets of more than 1. And so I'd recommend doing the same thing. If you don't have anyone to pour the wine for you, pick a few different examples of wines. You won't be able to see what color they are, but pour them into the glass non-blind. Put a Post-it note on the bottom of the glass, mix them up, walk away. Feel free to walk away for even longer because we want the temperature of the wines to be consistent. So if it was chilled white wine, it would come up in temperature. And if it was more room temperature red wine, it would stay the same. Mix them up, come back, and then try your blind tasting exercise. So it's something you can do with other people. It's something you can do by yourself. It's a heck of a party trick, but it's a great way to just really kind of hone in on a very specific aspect of blind tasting and improve your skills. It's such a simple technique. It requires some equipment, so it's not quite as easy as making, flashcards or things like that, but you're already gonna have the wine. You already understand the concept of blind tasting, so let's just make it a little bit harder. I'm a believer in training, a little harder, a little faster, to make things easier when you actually take the exam. You gotta push it a little bit more in practice to make the actual game day a little bit more, kind of approachable. And so I think this is a really great example of just removing one element of the blind tasting experience and making it truly, truly blind and seeing just how sharp your nose and palate are. So just a little tip that I developed for myself. Thanks to Fernando for introducing me to blind tasting with black glasses. But it's a fun little caveat. Obviously, these are glasses. You can certainly use them just to drink out of. It's not money spent in vain, but it's a really great way to just take what you know and what you're good at and what you're trying to be better at and just dial it up just a little bit further. So I hope you find this helpful, and thanks again for joining Study Hall.